The ledge was 18 inches wide. That was the part nobody mentioned at the auction. Not the auctioneer with his practiced smile, not the county clerk with her reading glasses on a chain, not the man in the seed cap who watched Riva sign the paperwork and shook his head at his wife like she'd done something worth pitying. 18 inches of limestone shelf, cut into the face of a bluff, 40 feet above Kettle Creek. The rock was pale gray, almost white in the September morning light, and the path curved out from the main cliff face and then back in again, narrowing at one point to something closer to 12. Below it, the creek ran brown and fast through the gorge. There were boulders down there. She could see them clearly. Riva pressed her back flat against the cliff wall and looked straight ahead, not down, not at the creek or the boulders or the space between her left boot and the edge of the world. Just the wall, just the gray limestone 3 inches from her nose, cold and solid, smelling of mineral and old rain. Her fingers were white where they gripped a crack in the rock above her head. She had told herself this wasn't something to be afraid of. She had slept in a car for 6 months and eaten gas station sandwiches for 3 days running and aged out of the foster system at 18 with $62 and a duffel bag, and none of those things had broken her. A narrow path on a rock face was not going to be the thing that did it. She moved her right foot forward, found the ledge, shifted her weight. The September wind came through the gorge without warning. Not violent, not a gust that would have knocked her over, just wind, the kind that moves through narrow spaces and finds your collar, and for one long second it hit her from the left side, and she felt the air where the ledge was not, and the 40 feet below her became very real and very present. She didn't fall. She pressed her palm harder against the rock and waited until her breathing steadied. Then she kept going. 3 days earlier, she hadn't known this ledge existed. 3 days earlier, she had been walking along Route 7 with a duffel bag on one shoulder and a dead car 3 miles behind her, and the biggest problem in her life had been finding somewhere to sleep before dark. The Honda Civic had made a sound like a cough, then a rattle, then nothing at all. She had guided it to the gravel shoulder, on muscle memory turned the key twice, and looked at the check engine light that had been glowing since March, like it was trying to tell her something she already knew. Route 7 ran through flat farm country, corn stubble and fence posts, the kind of landscape that goes on longer than it should. No gas station visible in either direction. No houses close enough to be useful before dark. The September sun was already dropping, pulling the color out of the sky in long horizontal bands of copper and orange. She sat there for a minute with her hands on the wheel. 2 years of driving had taught her the difference between a car that was done and a car that needed a rest, and this one was done. The Civic had made it from Columbus to Dayton to a series of farm towns with names she'd already forgotten, carrying her through the particular kind of aimlessness that wasn't aimlessness exactly, but was more like the space between one thing ending and another thing not yet having started. She took the duffel bag from the back seat and the olive green tin from the glove compartment. The tin was dented on one corner and barely larger than a paperback book. Inside it was her grandmother Agnes's sewing kit, needles, thread sorted by color into a small card, a thimble worn thin on one side, a measuring tape that clicked when you rolled it back, and tucked into the inside of the lid, held in place by a narrow strip of cardboard, a photograph of Agnes. The photograph was not glamorous. Agnes had not been a glamorous woman. She was sitting at a kitchen table in the apartment on Mercer Street, looking at something off camera. her face in the particular expression she made when she was thinking hard about something and didn't know anyone was watching. Her hands were on the table. Her hands were always working, always mending something, or holding something, or pressing something flat. Below the photograph, Agnes had written in her careful small handwriting, "Keep the name. It means something." Riva had read that line 100 times, maybe more. She had never asked Agnes what it meant because Agnes had died on a Tuesday afternoon when Riva was 14, and by then there had been other things to think about. Survival, the next placement, the one after that. The question of the name had stayed filed somewhere in the back of her mind, patient and unasked the way questions stay when there is no one left to ask them of. She knew the name had come from somewhere. Agnes had been married once briefly to a man who wasn't spoken of. The name Marsh was his. Agnes had kept it after he was gone, whatever gone meant, and had given it to her granddaughter's mother, and her granddaughter's mother had given it to Riva. That was the whole inheritance of the name as far as Riva had ever understood it. A few letters on a piece of paper, a line in Agnes's handwriting, a question she had never gotten around to asking. She locked the car out of habit, even though there was nothing left worth stealing. She started walking. The sign said Alderton 2 miles. She had never heard of it. The town came into view slowly. A water tower first, then a church steeple catching the last light, then rooftops in a row. Main Street was 4 blocks long, a diner called Rosie's with a hand-painted sign, a hardware store with a window display of rakes and late-season garden tools, a post office, a barber shop with a closed sign in the window that looked like it had been there since at least the previous spring. She smelled fried onions from the diner, and her stomach made a small, specific complaint that she had learned to acknowledge and then set aside. She would eat when she had a plan for the next 12 hours. She had $57 left after filling the gas tank that morning. No phone because the prepaid had run out of minutes 3 days ago. No plan beyond finding somewhere to sleep that wasn't a highway shoulder. At the end of Main Street, the county courthouse had a parking lot full of pickup trucks and folding chairs. A man with a microphone stood on a flatbed trailer holding a clipboard. A county surplus auction. Riva had seen them before in other town cities selling off equipment and vehicles and parcels of land that had stopped being useful. She drifted closer because it was something to watch while she figured out her next move, and because there was a table with a coffee urn at the edge of the crowd, and she had learned that surplus auctions usually had free coffee. She poured a cup and stood at the back of the crowd. The coffee was thin and slightly burnt, and she drank it anyway because it was warm. Lots came and went. A John Deere mower from 1982 that the auctioneer described as running on a good day. A tractor that attracted a small bidding war before settling at $300. A shipping container that went for $80 to a man who didn't seem particularly interested in it. A box truck with a bad transmission that went for $250 to a man who looked like he had done this before and knew exactly what he was buying and what he planned to do with it. She watched the transactions and drank the bad coffee and thought about the car on the shoulder of Route 7 and whether there was any possibility she could get it running or whether she was going to have to walk away from it. Then the auctioneer's voice shifted. Not much, just a small change in register, the way a person's voice changes when they already know how a joke ends. Lot 12, he said, half acre on the east side of town. Bluff View parcel sits on the north lip of Kettle Creek Gorge, formerly the site of the municipal stone pump house, built 1957. pump house sustained significant structural damage in 2019 when the cliff face partially eroded. The structure is currently condemned, and access to the pump house itself is restricted by county order. Parcel includes the half-acre flat on the bluff top, the pump house structure, all remaining rubble, and a chain-link fence with a gate. He smiled at the crowd. Starting bid $5. Nobody moved. Come on, he said. $5. You've spent more than that on coffee. He held up the mug he'd been drinking from, and a few people in the crowd laughed. The lot wasn't worth anything. That much was obvious. A condemned structure nobody could legally access on land that had been sitting empty for 6 years, offered at the minimum possible bid because the county needed it off its books. Nobody in the crowd was going to buy it because nobody in the crowd had any use for it. Nothing. He raised his gavel. Going once. $5, Riva said. Every head turned. She felt it. The collective weight of a crowd looking at a young woman with a duffel bag and road dust on her jeans who had just bid on a condemned parcel for $5 because she needed somewhere to sleep. She had felt that weight before in group homes and courtrooms and social services offices and school hallways in 6 different cities, and she had learned to let it pass over her like weather. Other people's assessments of her situation had not historically been useful, and she had stopped investing in them sometime around her 15th birthday. The auctioneer blinked. We have $5. Do I hear 10 silence? Sold, he said, and the gavel came down. Lot 12, to the young lady in the back. See the clerk for paperwork. A man in a seed cap leaned toward his wife. She just bought a pile of junk. His wife looked at Riva, and her expression was the particular mixture of pity and discomfort that Riva had cataloged and set aside years ago. Poor thing. She didn't mind what they thought. She was thinking about the half-acre of flat land at the edge of town, about what a person could do with a flat half-acre and a fence and somewhere to sleep that had her name on the deed. The clerk was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She took Riva's $5 bill and had her sign 3 forms and handed over a folded property deed without comment. Then she paused. The access path to the pump house is condemned, she said. County safety order been in effect since 2019. The path runs along the cliff face, 18 inches wide in most places. You understand that means you're not to use it. Riva looked at her. The path to the pump house. The clerk nodded. Goes along the north face of the bluff above the gorge. Gets narrow. The pump house itself is still structurally present, but it's tilted. Erosion took out a section of the cliff base underneath it. The county deemed it unsafe for access in 2019, and the order hasn't been lifted. Riva folded the deed and put it in the front pocket of her duffel bag. She understood, she said. She thanked the clerk. She walked east. The lot was at the end of Tower Road, a dirt track off Maple Street, a quarter-mile past the grain elevator. She followed it in the last of the evening light, the sky going purple and deep orange behind her, the road softening from gravel to packed dirt as it moved away from the street grid and toward the edge of things. She followed it until the road ended at a rusted chain-link fence with a gate hanging open on one hinge. The evening light was almost gone, painting the western sky in the colors of embers, and what it illuminated was this half an acre of rough ground wild grass and gravel, a concrete block outbuilding that might have been a storage shed, and at the northern edge, where the land simply stopped, the beginning of something. She walked to the fence line and looked down. The gorge was maybe 40 feet deep at this point. The walls, limestone and sandstone in layers, the color of wheat and cream and old ash. The layers were clear and legible, each one representing a different period of the stone's formation, hundreds of thousands of years, visible in 3 feet of cliff face. Kettle Creek ran at the bottom, dark and moving fast after recent rain, catching the last light in long interrupted lines where the current moved over the shallows. There were boulders down there rounded by water over a long time. She could see them clearly. And on the face of the north bluffs, running east along the cliff wall and then down and around a curve out of sight, was a narrow shelf of rock, the ledge. She stood at the edge and looked at it for a long time, at the narrow path and the cliff below it and the pump house. She could just make out at the curve of the bluff stone walls, built directly into the rock face, a building that had become part of the cliff it was built against. Even from here, in the failing light, she could see the tilt, the whole structure leaning slightly, the geometry of it wrong, in the way a picture hanging crooked is wrong obvious once you've seen it. The county said, "Don't go near it." The county had been saying that for 6 years, and nobody had. She went back to the flat section of the lot and found a patch near the north fence, sheltered by the remains of a concrete wall where she could set up her tarp. She had done this before, in parking lots and beneath highway overpasses, and once in a park in Columbus where the security light was broken and the ground was level and the night was dry. Setting up a tarp was a skill like any other. You learned it by doing it until you stopped thinking about it. She was tying off the second corner when she heard it, a low sound from somewhere near the open gate, a whimper thin and cautious, the kind of sound that doesn't expect to be answered. She stopped, picked up the length of rebar she'd already set aside by instinct, and walked toward the gate holding it loosely, not like a weapon exactly, but like something a person holds when they don't know what they're walking toward. The last light was almost gone. She clicked on her small flashlight and swept it across the fence line. The dog was sitting just inside the gate, German Shepherd or most of one, thin enough that the ribs were visible even under the dirty coat. The left front leg favored slightly, the paw set at an angle that suggested an old injury rather than a current one. Dark eyes that caught the flashlight and held it without flinching, watching her with the particular stillness of an animal that has learned to wait and see before it commits to anything. Not aggressive, not particularly hopeful either, just watching. "Hey," Riva said softly. The dog didn't move, didn't growl, didn't run, just watched. She set down the rebar, reached into the side pocket of her duffel, and took out the second half of her gas station sandwich, turkey and Swiss on white bread that had been stale that morning and was staler now. She unwrapped it and set it on the ground, 6 feet from the dog, and stepped back 3 paces and waited. The dog waited a full minute. She counted. Then it stood that slight favor on the left leg and walked forward and ate the sandwich in 3 bites. "You live here?" Riva asked. The dog looked at her. Its tail moved once, a single careful wag that committed to nothing. "Yeah," she said. "Me too, I guess." She named him Ridge that night because he kept walking the perimeter fence like he was checking the boundaries of something methodical and serious, the way a working dog with a job takes the job seriously. He settled about 10 feet away while she finished setting up the tarp, and she could hear him moving occasionally in the dark, those careful checks of the fence line. At some point in the dark hours before morning, he had moved closer. When she woke at first light, he was pressed against her side with his head on her arm and his eyes half open watching the fence line. She lay there for a few minutes, looking at the sky, lightening above the bluff edge. The stars were still out fading, more stars than she'd ever seen from the cities she'd moved through. Growing up in the system, she'd always been in cities or the suburbs of cities, places where the sky had a permanent orange glow from street lights and parking lots. She'd never seen a sky like this, the actual dark of a rural night with the Milky Way visible as a smear of light. She thought about Agnes, about the apartment on Mercer Street, which had smelled of coffee, and the particular fabric softener Agnes bought in bulk, and the window box of herbs that Agnes kept on the kitchen sill even in winter. She thought about sitting at that kitchen table at 7 in the morning watching Agnes sew buttons back onto a coat, the needle going through the cloth with a precise motion, the thread following in its exact arc. There had been a kind of instruction in watching that, a kind of teaching. When everything else falls apart, use your hands. Agnes had said it once while teaching Riva to patch a wall. She had said it without ceremony as a fact, and Riva had filed it away with the other useful facts of survival and had not understood for several years how thoroughly she would need it. She got up before the light was fully there and started working. The first 3 days were about the basics. There was a public restroom behind the courthouse that unlocked at 7 in the morning. She filled her water bottles at the sink. She ate sparingly, stretching her remaining dollars with bread and peanut butter from a gas station 2 miles down the highway. She learned that the gas station also had a microwave available for customers, which meant she could heat things, which changed the food calculation considerably. And she worked. She cleared the flat section of the lot by hand, dragging pieces of old equipment to the fence line, stacking broken concrete in piles, pulling grass and weeds from around the foundation slab of the storage shed, sorting debris by type because sorting things was how she thought and she needed to think. The shed was structurally present, but the door had been off its hinges long enough to let weather in, and the interior was damp and cluttered with the accumulated detritus of whatever the lot had been used for before the pump house stopped working. Metal pipes rusted to orange, old electrical conduit, a wooden workbench that was salvageable if she could dry it out. She sorted, she stacked, she dragged. Ridge worked the perimeter and occasionally came to sit beside her and watch her work with the evaluating expression of a dog, deciding whether the activity was useful. She was in the middle of moving a section of steel pipe on the second morning when she stopped and looked at the pump house. The ledge ran along the cliff face below the north fence line. She could see it from up here, the pale limestone path running east and curving out of sight. She could see where it narrowed. She could see the pump house at the curve, or most of it, the stone walls and the tilt in the roof with its missing sections. She had told the clerk she understood. She looked at the ledge for a long time. Then she went back to sorting pipe. On the fourth morning, a pickup truck slowed on Tower Road and pulled over. A woman got out. Late 60s, silver hair, cut close to her head, hands that told a long story about work, every line and callus and discoloration, the record of decades of physical labor. She wore a canvas apron over her clothes and carried a water jug like it weighed nothing. "You the one who bought the bluff lot," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's me," Riva said. "Delia Farrow. I own the hardware store on Main." She held out the jug. "You've been out here 4 days. People notice." Riva took it. The jug was cold and full, and she drank from it, right there, which was not something she would have done in front of most strangers. But Delia Farrow wasn't watching her the way most strangers watched. She was looking at the lot, at the cleared ground, the sorted piles, the tarp shelter tucked against the north fence with the duffel bag tucked under it. She was looking at the work, not at the person doing it. "You've done all this by hand," she said. "Don't have much else." Delia studied the lot for a moment longer. Then she reached into the truck bed and pulled out a pair of leather work gloves, the kind with reinforced palms and double stitching at the stress points. "Here, your hands are going to be hamburger if you keep going bare." Riva looked at the gloves. She had learned not to take things from people without understanding what they cost. Everything came with a price, or got taken back, or turned into something that meant you owed someone something you didn't have. It was a lesson that the foster system had taught her efficiently and repeatedly. Delia saw it in her face. She had the look of someone who had seen that particular expression before and understood exactly what it meant. "They're just gloves," she said. "I've got a whole store full of them. Come by if you need anything else. I'll run you a tab." "I can't pay a tab right now." "I didn't ask you to pay it right now." Delia put the tailgate up and got back in the truck. "That pump house has been sitting condemned for 6 years, she said through the open window. "Lot before it has been empty twice that long." She looked at Riva directly. "You're the first person to do anything with it. That counts for something." She drove away, leaving a small cloud of dust on the dirt road that hung in the still morning air, and then settled slowly. Riva put on the gloves. They fit. There was a man who watched her from the road for 3 weeks. She noticed him on the second day. A pickup truck parked at the edge of Tower Road, where it widened slightly before the fence gate. An older man sitting in the driver's seat with the window down, watching the work, not in a threatening way, not even in a particularly interested way at first, more in the way of someone who has seen things not work out before and is waiting to see whether this one will. He came back the next day and the day after that, always at roughly the same time in the morning, always parked in the same spot, always quiet. She noticed him the way you notice weather that hasn't turned into anything yet. She went back to work. On the 21st day he got out of the truck, I was in his early 70s, thick white hair under a canvas hat, a frame that had been larger, once broader in the shoulders and thicker through the chest, and still carried the memory of that size in the way he moved. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into work pants, and he carried a toolbox like it weighed nothing, which meant he'd been carrying toolboxes for a very long time and had made his peace with the weight of them. "I'm Grady Dutton," he said. "I live about a quarter mile that way." He pointed east through the trees toward a farmhouse. She could just see the roof line of, through the September canopy. "I've been watching you move rubble for 3 weeks." "That's a long time to watch," Riva said. "Wanted to see if you'd stick with it." He set the toolbox down and looked at the cleared foundation slab, the sorted piles, the partial structure of the storage shed where she'd been working on the door frame. Most people would have quit by day 3. Riva brushed her hands on her jeans. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Grady Dutton nodded like that was the most reasonable thing he'd heard in a long time. "I'm a carpenter," he said. "Retired. My wife Miriam passed 2 years ago, and I've been building things in my garage to keep busy." He paused there, the pause of a man who has been stopping himself mid-sentence for 2 years since a particular absence began, and the habit of stopping hadn't become natural yet. "Birdhouses, mostly." He said it quietly with something in his voice that wasn't quite wry and wasn't quite sad. "My daughter says I've made enough birdhouses for every bird in the county." He opened the toolbox. Inside were tools that had been cared for over decades, the metal surfaces clean and lightly oiled, the handles worn smooth in the specific places that a hand wears them over years of use. Hammers, a tape measure, a level, chisels with handles that had darkened to a deep amber. "You've got a cleared foundation and no structure," he said. "If you want help framing something, I'm available." She studied him, the way she studied everyone, looking for the angle, the cost, the reason. There was always a reason. Why, she asked. He looked at the lot, at the sky, then at her. "Because I'm 72 years old and I'm tired of building birdhouses." He stopped again with that particular pause. "And because Miriam would have been out here on day one with sandwiches and lumber if she'd been alive. She was that kind of person. I'm slower than she was, but I got here eventually." Ridge had walked over while they were talking and was sniffing Grady Dutton's boots with the focused attention he gave everything. The dog looked up at Riva. She looked at Ridge, then at Grady. "Okay," she said. "Show me how to frame a wall." Grady smiled for the first time. It was a real smile, the kind that changes a whole face, that moves something behind the eyes and opens up the lines of the expression. It changed his whole face. "Get me 2 sawhorses and a straight piece of lumber," he said, "and I'll show you everything I know." They started that afternoon. Grady brought more tools from his garage the next morning and a stack of scrap lumber he'd been collecting, in the way that people with workshops collect materials they can't quite bring themselves to throw away. He showed Riva how to measure twice cut once and swear only when the nail bent. He showed her how to check a corner with a framing square and how to plumb a post with a level. He showed her the difference between a nail that has been driven correctly and one that has been driven in a hurry, and why the difference matters 6 months later when you're living in something you built. I was patient in the way of someone who had taught these things before and didn't mind teaching them again, who understood that building skill takes time and that time is not wasted on something that matters. By the end of the first day together, they had the skeleton of a wall section lying flat on the foundation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "That's solid work," Grady said, stepping back to look at it. "I had a good teacher before you," Riva said. "My grandmother Agnes taught me how to fix things around the house. Plumbing, drywall, basic wiring." She ran her hand along the top plate of the wall frame. "She raised me after my mom died. Worked 2 cleaning jobs to keep the apartment. I used to help her fix things in the building because the landlord wouldn't." She paused. "She died when I was 14. Grady was quiet for a moment. He picked up a nail that had fallen and turned it in his fingers before pocketing it. "Miriam died 2 years ago," he said. "Pancreatic cancer. Fast once it started." He looked at the frame. "The house feels wrong without her in it. Too quiet in a way that a place can be quiet when it's missing the person it was made for. Building things helps." They didn't say anything else about it. They didn't need to. She found the first excuse to go down the ledge on the 17th day. She had been looking at it since the first night, thinking about what was on the other side. The condemned pump house, the stone building her $5 had purchased, built by someone into the face of a cliff 68 years ago. She had no good reason to go down there. The lot was on the flat section. Everything she was building was on the flat section. The pump house was condemned, which meant the county had formally told her it was dangerous, and Riva had spent enough time in systems that told her what was dangerous and what wasn't, to know that sometimes they were right. But Ridge had been walking to the edge of the bluff and sitting there and looking down since the day she arrived, every morning, every evening, like he was waiting for something or like he already knew something and was being patient about it. On the 17th morning, she tied a 20-foot length of rope to a fence post at the bluff edge, coiled the other end around her left hand, and stepped onto the ledge. The limestone was cool under her boots, solid, not crumbling, the surface textured by weather and the slow action of water on stone over a long time. She faced the cliff wall and moved sideways, her right hand trailing along the rock, her left hand paying out the rope slowly. The ledge was wider than it looked from above for the first 30 feet, maybe 2 feet at its widest, enough to stand on, with both feet flat. She moved carefully, testing each placement before committing weight. Then the bluff face curved, and there was a section ahead where the shelf thinned to something she would have to think carefully about. She reached it. 12 inches, maybe a little more, at the center, narrowing to less at the outer edge where the limestone had broken away at some point, clean at the break. Below her, on the left, the gorge dropped away. The creek sound was louder here, channeled by the rock walls into something that filled the space. The rope had run out of length. She was on her own. She looked at the wall in front of her. Just the wall. The limestone 3 inches from her face, pale gray, cold, smelling of mineral and old rain. She put her right hand flat against it, felt the solidity of it, something that had been here for millions of years and would be here long after any of this was resolved. She moved her right foot, found the ledge with the edge of her boot, shifted her weight. The September wind came through the gorge, not a strong wind, just the particular kind that moves through narrow places, finding the path of least resistance, and for one long second it hit her from the left, and she felt the air where the ledge was not, and the 40 feet below her became very real and very specific and very present. She didn't fall. She pressed her palm harder against the rock and waited, counted her breath. In, out. The wind moved past and the air settled, and she was still on the ledge. She kept moving. The pump house was at the end of a natural widening in the shelf, where the bluff curved back inward and the ledge broadened to 6 feet or more before meeting the base of the structure. The building was stone, real stone, limestone blocks cut and fitted with precision by someone who had known exactly what they were doing. The walls had been built directly into the cliff, the back of the structure, the cliff itself, the natural rock incorporated as the fourth wall, the door a heavy wooden thing with iron hardware that had rusted to a dark reddish brown, hung at a slight outward angle that tracked the tilt of the whole building. She pushed it open. The interior was dim. Light came through a long crack in the east wall where the stone had shifted with the tilt, a gap 2 inches wide that ran from floor to near the ceiling, letting in a vertical line of outside air and light through 2 small windows on the south face. Through the gap under the tilted door, the floor was stone flags, the same pale limestone as the cliff, and they were not level. They tilted toward the gorge wall, toward the crack and the light and the 40 feet of air beyond it. Everything in the room was moving slowly and imperceptibly toward the edge, the way a table tilts on an uneven floor, and you don't notice it until you watch something roll. Ridge was already inside. She had no idea how he'd gotten there. There was no path she knew of other than the ledge. He was standing in the center of the floor with his ears forward and his nose down, focused on a spot near the middle of the room where 2 sections of floor stone met in a line. She walked over to him. The crack between the stones was different from the other cracks. There were other separations in the floor, stress fractures from the tilt. the kind of damage you'd expect from a building trying to hold itself together while the ground underneath it moved. Those were irregular, raw edge, the kind of splits that happen when something breaks. This was not that. She crouched down, ran her gloved finger along the line. The gap was clean, the edges dressed the joint between the two sections, deliberate and precise. Someone had poured these two sections of floor separately and sealed the joint between them. The seal had darkened with age, but was still mostly intact, the material some kind of tar or caulk that had cured and hardened over decades. She knocked on the right side with her knuckle, solid, the flat sound of stone over earth. She knocked on the left side. The sound was different, a subtle difference, not dramatic, but different. There was space underneath. She sat back on her heels. Her pulse was doing something she noticed. She had been around enough construction, enough farm buildings and old structures and basements and crawl spaces to know what a foundation was supposed to look like. Poured stone or concrete rebar, anchor bolts. A floor was a floor. You didn't seal a hidden panel into the center of a floor unless you wanted a hidden panel, unless you wanted something underneath that floor to stay underneath it until someone went looking. Someone had built this on purpose. She came back the next morning with a pry bar she'd borrowed from Delia's store, explaining that she needed to work on some stuck concrete at the lot without specifying which concrete. She also had a rope tied to a fence stake at the top of the bluff, longer this time enough to reach the pump house. She came down the ledge faster than the first time because she had done it once and knew where the narrow section was and where to place her feet and where to put her hand. Ridge was already in the pump house when she pushed the door open. She worked the flat end of the bar into the joint and pushed. The old sealant cracked and crumbled in pieces, dry and brittle decades past its working life. She pushed harder, leaning her full weight into the bar, and the stone panel shifted, just an inch, but enough to confirm what she'd suspected. There was space underneath. She worked for 2 hours, levering each piece of the panel aside with the bar and her full body weight, the tilted floor, making every motion, something she had to think about, something to account for in the angle of each push and the placement of her feet. The gorge was visible through the east crack, the whole time 40 feet of air between the wall and the water below. Ridge paced in circles in the narrow space behind her, a low sound in his throat. When the opening was finally wide enough to look into, she looked. A chamber, maybe 5 feet deep, 3 feet across. The walls were poured concrete, smooth and dry, not a crack in them. Clean the way a sealed space stays clean when no moisture gets in. Whoever built this had known what they were building, had known how to waterproof, how to seal against groundwater, how to make something last in a damp limestone environment. And on the floor of the chamber, resting on the dry concrete, was a wooden box wrapped in dark oilcloth. Riva looked at it for a long time without moving. The September wind came through the gorge, outside through the crack in the east wall, a low sound that moved through the tilted room. Somewhere in the pump house, a loose piece of stone shifted against another with a dry sound like a tooth. Ridge pressed his nose to the opening and let out a single short bark, just one, then went quiet and looked at her. She lowered herself into the chamber. The space was tight, her shoulders almost touching both walls. The oilcloth was secured with twine that had gone brittle with age and snapped when she touched it. She lifted the box carefully, surprised by its weight, and climbed back out into the tilted room. She carried it up the ledge and across the flat lot to the north fence and sat down in the grass with it on her knees. Ridge pressed his nose against every surface of it, methodical and thorough, sniffing each seam and edge and corner. "Easy," she said. "Let me see." She cut the remaining twine with her pocket knife. The oilcloth fell away from a wooden box with dovetailed corners and a hinged lid. Dark walnut smoothed and carefully finished the wood grain visible under the aged surface. No lock. Someone had built this with attention, with the understanding that what was inside deserved a container made well. She lifted the lid. 4 things organized and packed with care. A leather-bound journal, the cover cracked along the spine but intact. A stack of photographs wrapped in wax paper, the paper brittle but unbroken. A bundle of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. A sealed envelope yellowed at the edges with handwriting across the front. She picked up the envelope first. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the kind that came from a generation that learned penmanship in school as a real subject with real standards, that knew the difference between a letter formed correctly and one formed sloppily, and understood why the difference mattered. She read what it said: "To whoever carries the Marsh name forward." Her hand went still. Marsh, her name, her mother's name. Agnes's married name from the husband. Agnes never talked about the one who had left or died or simply stopped being mentioned before Riva was old enough to know the right questions to ask. The name Agnes had written in the lid of the tin box. Keep the name, it means something. Riva set the envelope down on the grass and picked up the journal instead. The leather was cracked along the spine, the pages stiff but intact, the ink still clear. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the envelope. Careful, deliberate, slightly formal, each letter given its full space. The first entry was dated April 12, 1957. Started work on the municipal water system today. The council voted 6-1 to approve the project. Mayor Davis shook my hand and said the town had been waiting 20 years for clean water. I told them we'd have it running by fall. My name is Walter Marsh, and I am the new water commissioner of Alderton. Riva read the words twice. She sat in the grass at the edge of the bluff, with Ridge pressed against her leg, and the pump house below her, the one that was still standing after 68 years on a tilted cliff face, built by the hands of a man who shared her name. She turned to the next page. The light was good. The September morning was clear and still. The gorge below caught the sound of the creek and held it a low, constant presence, underneath everything like something breathing steadily. She read. Walter Marsh had good handwriting. That was the first thing Riva noticed even before the content of the entries settled into meaning. The letters were formed with precision, each word given its full space, no letters crowded or leaning, the kind of handwriting that came from a generation that believed it mattered how you put things on a page, that the act of writing was itself a form of care and attention. She read for 3 hours that first morning. She sat in the grass at the bluff edge with Ridge pressed against her leg and the journal open on her knees, and she followed Walter Marsh through the years he had spent building something in the town where she had just spent $5 on a piece of condemned ground. He had started the pump house in April of 1957. The original plan he wrote had been a standard municipal pump station drawing from the aquifer below the bluff, but the limestone formations meant the most reliable water source was deeper than conventional drilling could reach at budget, and the natural pressure differential in the gorge provided a mechanical advantage that Walter had figured out how to use. So instead of a flat building on flat land he had built into the cliff, he had hired 4 men from town, local workers who knew stone and didn't mind heights, and they had worked through the summer cutting limestone blocks from the gorge walls and fitting them together against the cliff face. Hyde described the work in the language of a man who loved what he was doing, pressure calculations written out in the margins with careful decimal points, notes about the quality of different stone sections, which ones were dense enough for the walls and which would serve as fill, a long entry about the day they completed the back wall and realized the cliff face itself was sound enough to serve as structural support, which changed the whole load geometry and meant they could build lighter on the other three sides. He wrote about his crew by name: Tom Farrow, Pete Auclair, Bud Alcott, Del Moran. Good men, he wrote. Tom Farrow was steady as any man I've ever worked beside, never complained, never cut a corner. His daughter helps in the store on weekends and brings us sandwiches on Tuesdays without anyone asking her to. Reva stopped. Tom Farrow. She read the entry again slowly. Tom Farrow, steady as any man I've ever worked beside. Delia Farrow owned the hardware store on Main Street. Delia Farrow, who had brought a jug of water on the fourth day and a pair of work gloves and the kind of steady gaze that didn't ask for thanks, whose father apparently had built the pump house she was currently sitting next to. The connections were starting to form. She could feel them forming the way a picture becomes visible when you've been staring at the individual lines long enough. She kept reading. He wrote about his wife, Ellen, small, specific things, the lunches she brought to the work site every day, wrapped in cloth napkins, the way she laughed at his calculations when he showed them to her, not because she didn't understand them, but because she thought he was performing for her, and he was, and they both knew it. She appears in a photograph I'd like to take, he wrote once, standing at the edge of the bluff with her hair loose in the wind, looking at the gorge. I told her she looked like she was deciding something. She said she was deciding whether the view was worth the walk. I said it was going to be worth more than that by fall. She said she'd believe it when the water ran. It ran in October of 1957. Walter described the day in 2 pages, the longest entry in the first section of the journal. The council members came, and the mayor and most of the town, and when the pump ran for the first time and the water moved through the pipes, they'd laid under 3 blocks of Main Street and out of a test faucet rigged up on a folding table in the courthouse parking lot. People had clapped, and someone had brought a cake, and Walter had stood with Ellen's hand in his and thought about his crew and the shape of their work on the cliff face. I built this with my own hands and other good people's hands, and it is the best thing I have ever done, he wrote. The water is clean and cold, and it came from the rock we cut together, and it is going to run in this town for as long as anyone takes care of the system properly. He was right about the water. He was wrong about how long he'd be the one taking care of it. The entries from 1959 onward had a different quality. The handwriting was the same, careful and deliberate, but there was a new kind of pressure in it, the kind you feel in a person's words when they are trying to be precise about something that makes them want to throw things. A man named Gerald Greer had moved to the area. He'd bought farmland east of Alderton, 300 acres, with the stated intention of developing residential properties, housing for families, he said publicly. A real community expansion, the kind of growth a small town needed to survive into the next decade. The council had welcomed him. Gerald Greer had money, which meant he had credibility, which in 1959, in a county like this one, meant he had the ear of the people who made decisions. What he needed was water. The municipal system Walter had built was the only reliable source in the township. Well water in the area ran, inconsistent, contaminated, in places by agricultural runoff, insufficient for the kind of density that development would require. Greer came to the council with a proposal he would invest in expanding the water infrastructure, funding new lines and additional capacity in exchange for formal co-governance rights over the water supply. Walter had written his response in the clearest language in the journal. "I wants to own the water," he wrote. "That is all this is. He doesn't want to improve it. He wants to control it, and once he controls the water, he controls who builds where, and who pays what, and who gets served, and who doesn't. A town's water supply is not something one private citizen should own." I said this at the June meeting clearly, with the calculations to support it. Half the room agreed with me. The other half was looking at the check Greer was waving around. Over the next 2 years, the entries documented a slow-motion campaign. Rumors appeared in the county paper, questions about Walter's management of public funds, nothing specific enough to investigate, but present enough to seed doubt. A letter to the editor suggesting an audit. The audit found nothing wrong, every dollar accounted for, every receipt in order, every purchase properly documented. But damage isn't always about the finding. Sometimes it's about the process. 3 council members who had voted with Walter changed their positions within 6 months of the audit request. Whether they changed because they believed the rumors or because they were following someone else's instructions, Walter didn't know. He wrote about it both ways, turning it over in the pages the way a person turns something over when they can't quite resolve it. In March of 1961, the council voted 4-3 to replace Walter as water commissioner. They didn't fire him for cause. They restructured the position, eliminated his title, created a new one with different language, gave it to a man Greer had recommended from outside the county. Same responsibilities, same building, same water, different name on the door. Legal, technically, he wrote. But everyone in that room knew what it was. The last Alderton entry was dated 2 weeks after the vote. "I sealed the chamber today. I have been building it for 3 months in the spaces between other work, mixing concrete in small batches, carrying it down the ledge at night so no one would see the materials or ask questions I didn't want to answer. The walls are poured and cured. The floor panel is set and sealed. No one knows about it except me. I put inside it everything that cannot be taken away. If they take everything else, they cannot take what's buried in the thing I built with my own hands." Those were the last words Walter wrote in Alderton. The next entry was from a motel in Missouri, dated 2 weeks later. "We left, Ellen Claire and me. I loaded the truck in one night and we drove south. Ellen is sick. She won't tell me how bad, but I can see it in how she moves in the morning and how she saves her energy for the moments that count. She's more deliberate now. Claire cried the first 2 days. She's 8 years old enough to understand we're leaving, too young to understand why. I told her we would come back someday. I don't know if that's true." Riva closed the journal. She sat for a long time without opening it again. The September morning had moved into afternoon while she read, the light changing over the gorge, the shadows lengthening and shifting as the sun moved west. Ridge had fallen asleep against her leg. She could feel his breathing, the slow rise and fall of it, steady and uncomplicated. She thought about what she'd just read. She thought about the name Tom Farrow in the journal and Delia Farrow at her truck 4 days ago with a water jug and a pair of work gloves and the look that didn't need anything from Riva in return. She thought about the fact that Delia's father had built the pump house, that he'd brought sandwiches on Tuesdays, that he'd kept coming to work every day for someone who had been driven out. She gathered the photographs, the bundle of papers, the sealed envelope, and the journal, and she wrapped them in the oilcloth and carried them up the ledge and into the storage shed. She changed her shirt, shook the dust out of her hair as well as she could without a mirror, and walked to Main Street. Delia was behind the counter sorting a box of fasteners when Riva came through the door. She looked up once and then back down at her work the way she always did. No performance in the looking, just acknowledgement that Riva was there. "I need to show you something," Riva said. She set the journal on the counter and opened it to the entry about the pump house crew. Delia set down the box of fasteners. She leaned forward and read. She read slowly the way a person reads when they're making sure they're not mistaking one thing for another. Then she was quiet for a moment, just quiet looking at the page. "Tom Farrow," she said. "That's my father. He built it with Walter Marsh," Riva said. "He's mentioned in 5 or 6 entries. Walter says he was steady, that he never cut a corner." Something moved in Delia's face. Not surprise, not exactly. More like recognition finding its way to the surface after a long time underground. "Dad talked about that pump house," she said. "Not often. He wasn't a man who talked about the past much. Preferred to keep moving forward, which I always thought was the right instinct. But he'd say sometimes that it was the best work he'd done, that the man who designed it knew what he was doing and wasn't afraid to do it right, even when doing it right was harder." She paused, and then he'd stop, like there was something else he was going to say, and decided not to. "There was something else," Riva said. She turned to the March 1961 entries and set the journal on the counter. Delia read. She read for a long time. The store was quiet. A car passed on Main Street. Somewhere in the back, a refrigeration unit hummed. Ridge sat in the doorway watching the street with his ears forward. When Delia looked up, her expression was different from anything Riva had seen on her face yet. Harder and softer at once. The expression of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has just discovered a name for what they've been carrying. She turned and went to the back room without saying anything. Riva waited. She heard a drawer open, then another, then the sound of paper, old paper, the sound it makes when it's been folded the same way many times, and the fibers have learned the shape. Delia came back with a piece of paper in her hand. She set it on the counter. It was a photocopy of a document, the copy made years ago on the kind of copier that produced slightly gray backgrounds, the original document evidently typed on a standard county form. Meeting minutes, Alderton Town Council special session, dated March 14, 1961. The content was bureaucratic and dry, and the language moved carefully around what it was doing, but the meaning was plain enough. Motion to restructure the Water Commission. Motion sponsored by council members Dawson, Pruitt, and Greer. Vote 4-3 in favor. At the bottom, in handwriting that was not the same as the typed text, someone had written in blue ink, "Wrong. All wrong." Tom Farrow's handwriting, Riva guessed, though she would never know for certain. "Dad kept that in his files his whole life," Delia said. "I found it after he died when I was going through things. I didn't know what to do with it, who to give it to." She looked at the journal cover on the counter. "Marsh, that's your name. He was my grandfather." Delia looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter and found 2 cups and poured coffee from the carafe she kept back there and slid one across to Riva without asking whether she wanted it. They drank the coffee and didn't say anything for a while. The black SUV arrived on a Tuesday. Clean, expensive, the kind of vehicle that announces its own importance before the door opens. It pulled down Tower Road and through the bluff lot gate, and the man who stepped out was in his late 40s, gray at the temples, the build of someone who had been athletic once and had maintained enough of it to still carry himself that way. Blue dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He had a business card in his hand before he finished surveying the lot. "I'm Nate Greer," he said. "Greer Development." He held out the card. Riva didn't take it. He set it on the nearest pile of sorted concrete rubble. "This property was included in the surplus auction in error," he said. His voice was the voice of a person explaining something obvious to someone who hasn't yet understood it. "It's part of the Bluff Vista Development Corridor, which has been in planning for 2 years. There was a commercial overlay designation in the county's 2020 master plan, which should have prevented it from being listed as surplus. I've been in contact with the assessor's office, and I'll be filing a formal challenge to the sale." "The sale was legal," Riva said. "I signed the paperwork with the county clerk. Paperwork can be reviewed." He looked around the lot, taking in the cleared ground, the partial structure framing the tarp shelter, folded neatly near the fence now that the weather had been dry. "I'm not trying to create problems for you. I just need you to understand that this piece of land has been part of a larger plan, the kind of plan that doesn't work if one parcel drops out of the framework." "I don't know anything about your plan," Riva said. "I know the auction was legal and I bought the lot." Something moved in his face then, not anger, something closer to the adjustment a very patient person makes when they encounter a variable they didn't account for and need to recalibrate. Ridge was standing beside Riva with his ears flat and a low sound starting in his chest. "I'll be in touch," Nate Greer said. He walked back to the SUV, opened the door, and paused with his hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'd encourage you to think about your actual options here. A half-acre on a condemned bluff with no utilities and no structure isn't a foundation for anything practical." He drove away. The dust from his tires drifted across the lot and settled slowly. Riva looked at Ridge. Ridge looked at the gate. She went back to the framing. The bundle of papers with the blue ribbon turned out to be savings bonds. 16 of them Series E, dated between 1956 and 1962, small denominations, most of them $50, $100, one for $500, which had felt like a significant sum to whoever had purchased it in 1960 on a water commissioner's salary, pulling it together month by month from a position that paid respectably but not generously. She spread them on the concrete slab and looked at them for a long time without touching them more than necessary. She knew bonds grew over time. She didn't know exactly how much, or whether bonds this old were still redeemable, or whether 6 decades of sitting in a sealed concrete chamber in a condemned pump house had done something to their validity. She was afraid to find out, afraid in 2 directions, at once afraid they would be nothing expired, paper worth less than what it cost to print them, and afraid in a different way, with a different quality of feeling she didn't examine too closely, that they would be something real. Delia drove her to the bank the next morning. She hadn't asked Delia to. Delia had appeared at the lot the morning after the Nate Greer visit, looked at Riva's face, looked at the bonds spread on the slab, and said, "I'm going to Main Street. Come if you want." That was all she said. Riva had wrapped the bonds carefully in a sheet of paper and put them in an envelope from the storage shed and gotten in the truck. The bank manager was a woman named Mrs. Faulkner, who came to her office door when the teller flagged the situation. She was in her 60s, careful in her movements, and she laid the bonds out one at a time on her desk and pulled up a calculator and a maturity table on her computer screen and didn't say anything for a long time. You understand these have been accumulating interest for over 60 years, she said finally. Riva said she understood. Mrs. Faulkner finished her calculations. She set the calculator down and looked up with an expression that Riva would remember for a long time afterward. Not theatrical, just the face of someone who has just delivered this particular kind of news and knows to give the recipient time. The combined matured value of these 16 bonds is $52,341. The number arrived in Riva's mind the way a very large sound arrives. First, the impact before the sound itself has been processed, then the slow processing, then the understanding. She sat very still. "I'm sorry," she said. "How much?" $52,341. Riva gripped the arms of the chair. Her vision narrowed to a point, then expanded. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Faulkner said. "Yes." She heard her own voice come out quieter than she intended. "I just need a minute." Mrs. Faulkner gave her the minute. She gave her 5. When Riva could breathe at a normal rate again, they talked through the process for redemption. It would take about 2 weeks. There would be paperwork to verify her identity and her connection to Walter Marsh as a direct descendant. The property deed and the journal would help establish the chain. Mrs. Faulkner was methodical and kind in the way of someone who had delivered surprising news to many different people and had learned not to rush any of them past it. Riva walked out of the bank into the October afternoon. She got into Delia's truck and sat in the parking lot and did not start the engine. She sat there with her hands in her lap and looked at the ordinary afternoon on Main Street, the hardware store, the diner, a woman walking a dog, a teenager on a bicycle. Delia sat beside her. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask what the number was. She just sat her hands in her lap, looking out the windshield at the afternoon, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. After a while, Riva started crying. It wasn't neat. It was the other kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and moves through you whether you want it to or not, the kind that empties you out and leaves you lighter afterward, the kind that has been waiting longer than you knew it was waiting. She pressed her face into her hands and let it happen. She had not cried since Agnes's funeral. She had not allowed it because there had always been something else to hold, another placement, to navigate another set of rules, to learn another version of the same institution in a different building. Delia put her hand over Riva's hand on the console between them. That was all. No words, no attempt to explain or interpret or manage the moment. Just the weight and warmth of another person's hand saying, "I am here. I am not going anywhere. Take as long as you need." She had been in the foster system for 9 years. In those 9 years, she could count on one hand the number of adults who had simply sat with her in a hard moment without trying to fix it or move past it or explain it away or make it about what it meant for the future. She had not realized until right now, in this truck, in this parking lot, how much she had needed exactly this kind of stillness from another person. She cried until the crying was done. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked out the windshield at the street. $52,000, she said. Delia's hand was still on hers. Yes, he saved it, bond by bond, from a water commissioner's salary. He saved what he could, Delia said. He put it somewhere he thought would last. Reva thought about the chamber, the concrete walls smooth and dry, the dress joints, the careful waterproofing. Someone who built things right and built them to last, putting the most important things inside the most solid thing he'd ever made, trusting the thing he'd built to keep them. She was still sitting with that thought when Nate Greer's lawyer's letter arrived 4 days later. Delia brought it, certified mail addressed to the lot on Tower Road, which did not have a mailbox redirected to the hardware store because Reva had listed Delia's address as a contact when she'd set up the county extension office account. Delia held it between two fingers as she walked through the lot gate, the way you carry something you're not sure about. Reva opened it, standing in the morning sun with Ridge at her feet. The letter was formal and dense, and it took 2 readings to get through the legal language to the substance. Greer Development was filing a formal objection with the County Board of Supervisors, citing 2 separate grounds. First, the commercial overlay designation in the 2020 master plan, which Greer's attorney argued made the surplus listing procedurally improper. Second, a claim that the Series E savings bonds found on the property, having been purchased by a county employee during his tenure in a public role, might constitute public assets under a provision of state municipal finance law that regulated how county employees could acquire value using public time and resources. Both the property and the bonds, the letter said, were subject to review pending the board hearing. Any redemption of the bonds was advised against until the matter was resolved. Reva read the second part again. They're going after the bonds, she said. Delia read the section. She was quiet for a moment. That's a stretch, she said finally. A real stretch. Walter bought those with his own money on his own time. But Greer's lawyer is good enough to make it sound like a genuine question. And a question is enough to freeze the redemption process for months, maybe years, if they push it right. The hearing was scheduled for November, 6 weeks away. That evening after dark, after Delia had gone, and the tools were put away, and the framing work set down for the night, Grady Dutton pulled his truck into the lot. He didn't announce himself. He got out, nodded once at Ridge, and walked to the corner of the foundation slab where the framing had started. He pulled a tape measure from his pocket and measured something. Then he made a note in the small spiral notebook he carried and measured something else. Reva watched him from across the lot. "Why are you here tonight?" she said. Grady didn't look up from the tape measure. He pulled it to a corner post and read the number. "Miriam would have been here the same day you bought the lot," he said. "She wouldn't have waited 3 weeks. She'd have shown up with sandwiches and asked where to start." He wrote the number in the notebook. "I moved slower than she did, but I got here." He folded the tape measure and put it in his pocket and looked at the framing. "The legal thing will work out or it won't," he said, "but the building needs to happen either way. You stop building because of a letter, and you're already giving ground you don't have to give." He picked up a piece of lumber from the stack and set it against the framing in a position that Reva recognized immediately as correct, the way you recognize correctness when you've been learning something long enough. She walked over. She picked up the other end. They worked until 10 in the evening without saying much else. She went back to the journal that night. She had been reading it in pieces, fitting it around the work and the Greer situation and the business of keeping herself fed and functional. She had finished the front section, the Alderton years and the Missouri years, the entries that grew shorter and darker as Walter moved his family south, and Ellen's health declined, and Claire grew up confused and angry in a place that wasn't home. She had not yet opened the back section. She had noticed it days ago. 40 pages from the back, starting from the rear cover, and working forward, written in different ink with handwriting that was recognizably Walter's but older, the letters less, even the pen pressing harder into the pages than it had in the front. She had let those pages stay closed because she had been saving something. Not sure what exactly, just saving it the way you save the last piece of something good because you want to arrive at it when the time is right. That night, she sat in the storage shed with the lantern going and Ridge beside her and the wind in the gorge below, and she opened to the back section. The first entry was dated November 4th, 1997. I haven't written in this journal in 34 years. Ellen is gone. She passed on March 9th, 1970. Cancer. I held her hand until the end and promised her I would take care of Claire. I broke that promise. Riva turned the page. Claire had left at 17, Walter wrote. Same age Ellen was when she left her own parents' house. He wrote it with a kind of recognition. The way you describe something, you understand too well. She packed a bag one night and was gone by morning. Left a note that said she would call when she was ready. She never called. I had spent 3 years looking for her, hired a private investigator with money he didn't have. The man had found traces, a job in Indianapolis, an apartment in Columbus, a name on a lease in Dayton. But every time he'd tracked her to one city, she'd already moved to the next. She didn't want to be found. She had made that decision clearly and consistently, and there was nothing to do about it. I stopped looking in 1974, he wrote. I was 63 years old, living in a rented room in Springfield, Missouri, working as a maintenance man at a school. I had lost my wife and my daughter and my town and my work. The only thing I still owned was a piece of land in a place I couldn't go back to, and a box buried under a pump house I'd built for people who had since decided they didn't want what I'd built. The entries after 1997 were spaced years apart. His 70th birthday mentioned in a single sentence, his 75th, notes about a heart condition that required medication he could barely afford on a maintenance worker's retirement, a knee that needed replacing that he decided to manage without replacing because the surgery was expensive and he had lived with discomfort before, the slow, careful inventory of a body measuring out what it had left. Then on June 2nd, 2009, the handwriting changed. It became urgent. The letters more crowded, the spacing less, even the pen pressing harder into the paper, the way handwriting changes when the hands are not keeping pace with what the mind needs to say. A woman from the state of Ohio called me today, a social worker named Mrs. Kessler. She told me that my daughter Claire died in a car accident on January 19th of this year. She was 39 years old. Riva stopped. She read the sentence again. January 19th, 2009. Claire Marsh, 39 years old. Mrs. Kessler said Claire had a daughter Walter had written, a little girl named Riva. She is 4 years old. Claire had listed me as next of kin on a form she filled out at the hospital when Riva was born. That's how they found me. The first time anyone has found me in decades. The lantern made a small sound. The wind moved through the gorge outside. I asked Mrs. Kessler if I could take Riva Walter had written. I told her I would do whatever it required. She said there would be an evaluation. I'm 81. I have a heart condition. I live in a one-room apartment. I don't have a car. I told her I'd do whatever it took. She said she'd be in touch. 2 weeks later, the state denied my petition. They said I am too old and too ill to care for a child, that placing Riva with me would not serve her best interests. They said she would be placed in the foster care system where she would receive proper care from qualified guardians. I told them I am her grandfather. They said that wasn't enough. Riva set the journal down. She pressed her palms flat against the floor of the shed. The concrete was cold against her skin. She concentrated on that, the specific temperature of it, the solid fact of it. He had known about her. He had tried to find her. He had been denied, and he had kept trying. The entries that followed were brief. He wrote about calling Mrs. Kessler every month for a year asking for updates. She gave him very little. Riva was in a group home. Riva was doing well in school. Riva had been moved to a different facility. He wrote about things. He had sent a blanket. He had knitted a photograph of Claire as a baby, a letter addressed to Riva. He had no way of knowing if any of them were delivered. Most of them he suspected were not. Riva thought about the group homes, the succession of them, 8 in 4 years, each one with its procedures and its front desk and its protocols for incoming mail. She thought about what arrived at front desk and what got processed and what got held and what got lost between one placement and the next. She thought about a hand-knitted blanket arriving at a group home where a 10-year-old she used to be was sleeping, and whether anyone had thought to forward it when she moved. She had not received any of it, but he had sent it. He had been sending things into the system hoping. She picked up the journal and kept reading. The final entries in the back section were spaced more widely. 2010, 2011, short, careful, the handwriting, working harder for the letters now. His health declining in ways he described, without drama, the way he described everything. Notes about medication, a fall in the school parking lot that turned out to be nothing serious, but which shook him more than a fall that had been nothing serious had ever shaken him before. The particular loneliness of a person who has outlasted everyone who knew them in the context where they made the most sense. Then on September 12th, 2012, the last thing he ever wrote, I'm going back to Alderton. I know the pump house is probably condemned or worse by now. I know the town doesn't remember me, or if they do, it's in the way towns remember, the thing that happened before the thing they care about. But the box is still there. I built that chamber to last 100 years, and it hasn't been 100 years yet. Inside it is everything I have left to give. I've written a letter. I'm going to put it in the box with the bonds and the photographs. Whoever finds it, whether it's Riva or someone else who carries the Marsh name, they'll know what happened. They'll know I tried. I'm leaving tomorrow morning. 9 hours of driving. My heart isn't good, but I have enough medication for the trip there and back. I just need to open the chamber, put the letter in, and seal it again. If I can do that, then at least something of me survives in the place where I did my best work. I built that pump house to give water to a town that needed it. I'm going back to make sure it still gives something to whoever comes next. That was the last thing Walter Marsh wrote. Riva sat in the shed for a long time without moving. She was trying to work out what it meant. If Walter had written that entry on September 12th, 2012, and planned to drive to Alderton the next day, and if the letter was inside the box, sealed in the chamber, then he had made it. He had driven to Alderton. He had gone down the ledge. He had opened the chamber and put the letter in and sealed it. She had the letter, sealed still. She had been carrying it for days without opening it, waiting until she understood enough of the story to read it properly. She looked at it now, the yellowed envelope, the neat handwriting on the front. To whoever carries the Marsh name forward. She carried it down the ledge the next morning. She didn't know why. It felt like it needed to be read there, in the pump house, in the place where he had built the chamber. It just did. Some things need the right room. She sat on the tilted floor with her back against the cliff face wall, the solid rock that had been the back of this building for 68 years. The east wall showed its familiar crack, the gorge visible through it in a long vertical line of gray morning light. The floor slanted gently beneath her. Ridge lay across her legs. She opened the envelope. 2 pages, the same handwriting, older and less even than the journal's front section, but still Walter's, still deliberate. To whoever carries the Marsh name forward. If you're reading this, you found your way here. You found the pump house, or what's left of it. You found the chamber I built into the floor when I was 37 years old and still believed I could protect what I'd made. My name is Walter Marsh. I was the water commissioner of Alderton from 1957 to 1961. I built this pump house with my own hands and 4 good men, and I poured every foundation and fitted every stone and tested every valve myself. It was the best thing I ever did for this town. The second best thing I ever did was raise my daughter Claire in it. I lost both. The pump house was taken from me by politics and a man who wanted to own the water more than he wanted to serve the town. Claire was taken from me by my own stubbornness and the kind of bad luck that follows when one wrong choice sends everything in the wrong direction. I don't know who you are. Maybe you're Riva, my granddaughter. A social worker named Mrs. Kessler told me about you in 2009. 4 years old when I found out you existed. I tried to bring you home. The state said I was too old and too sick to care for a child, and maybe they were right about that. But I want you to know I tried. I drove to the courthouse in Jefferson City twice. I wrote 6 letters to the foster care board. I called every month for a year. I hired a man to track which homes you went to so I would know where you were. They never let me see you. I am sorry for that. If you're not Riva, that's all right too. Whoever you are, you found this place and cared enough to look, and that is enough. The bonds are yours. The land is yours. The photographs and the journal are yours. I built this pump house to give water to a town that needed it. I built this chamber to give a future to whoever comes next. If you're reading this, you found your way home. Build something. Stay. Walter Marsh. September 2012. Riva folded the letter. She held it against her chest and looked at the crack in the east wall, at the line of light coming through it, at the gorge below the creek, moving over the pale boulders. She sat there for a while with the letter against her chest and Ridge across her legs, and the creek sound coming up through the limestone steady and unhurried. I had made it here. He had come down the ledge. He had opened this floor. He had put the letter in the box and sealed it, and then he had gone back up the ledge and gotten into his truck and driven away. She knew he hadn't made it far. She knew that without yet knowing the specific shape of it. The letter was here. That meant he had gotten this far. What happened after was a question she would need to answer, but not right now. She sat there for a while longer. Then she needed to know. She carried the letter up the ledge carefully and walked to the lot gate, and she almost didn't notice the girl standing outside it. Almost. She was 17 maybe, thin in the way of someone who had been missing meals with some regularity. A garbage bag in her right hand, the kind you use when you're carrying everything you own and you don't have luggage, because luggage is something you have when you stay somewhere long enough to need it. A hoodie several sizes too large. Sneakers with the soles beginning to separate from the uppers the adhesive giving up. She was standing at the gate looking at the lot, at the partial framing of the structure Riva and Grady had been building, at the storage shed with its neat stacks of material, at Ridge, who had gone to the gate and was sitting just inside it, looking at the girl with his ears forward and his head tilted at the angle he used for things that required evaluation. The girl looked at Ridge, then at the lot, then at Riva. "I saw the sign," she said, "on the highway. Community workshop, free tools and classes." Riva had put the sign up 2 weeks ago, a piece of plywood painted by hand in the colors she had on hand. Delia had told her it looked like a child had made it, and Riva had said, "Good. Children need workshops too." She looked at the girl at the gate, at the garbage bag, at the separated souls. 3 weeks ago she had thought, "When I was 17, I would have given anything for a place like this, a place with actual work and real tools and someone to show you how to use them." She had said it to Grady while they were framing, not meaning to say it out loud, and he had not replied, just measured the next board, and she had thought the sentence had fallen away. It hadn't fallen away. It had just been waiting. She pushed the gate open. "Come in," she said. "I've got peanut butter sandwiches and some soup someone made me, and I could use a hand with something." The girl hesitated. 1 second too, the particular hesitation of someone who has been to new places before and learned that new places usually disappoint. Then she walked through the gate with the garbage bag bumping against her leg. Ridge stood up and moved aside to let her pass, which was the closest Ridge came to welcoming a stranger, and Riva had learned to read his calibrations. "I'm Riva," she said. "Simone," the girl said. They walked toward the storage shed together. She would find out the rest of Walter's story tomorrow. Tonight there was soup to heat and a door frame that needed the last 2 bolts set before the weather changed. She picked up a wrench. The county library was on the south end of Main Street, between the post office and a building that used to be a pharmacy and was now a real estate office. It had the particular smell of small-town libraries, everywhere old paper and carpet cleaner, and the specific quiet that accumulates in rooms where people have been coming to think for decades. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, had been there long enough that she showed Delia and Riva to the microfilm machine without asking what they were looking for, which Riva appreciated. They sat in the room with the machine and the archived film canisters sorted by year and publication, and Delia found the Alderton Register canisters from 2012 with the efficiency of someone who knew the room. "What are we looking for?" Delia said. "Walter left September 13th, 2012, Riva said. The letter was dated the day before. He said it was a 9-hour drive from Springfield, so he'd have arrived sometime on the 13th. She kept her voice level when she said it. She had been keeping her voice level about this since the previous night, because the alternative was to sit in the pump house until the thing she was feeling moved through her, and she didn't have time for that yet. Delia loaded the first canister, and they began moving through pages. October of 2012. The paper ran twice weekly, Tuesdays and Fridays. She wound past town council notes and local business advertisements and an article about the high school football team and a photograph of someone's prize hog at the county fair. Then she found it. October 9th, 2012. Second page below the fold, a short article of 4 paragraphs, the kind of article that appears in small county papers when something has happened that requires acknowledgement, but whose subject had no local connection to speak of. The headline read, unidentified man found deceased on Route 7. An elderly man had been found deceased in his vehicle on Route 7, approximately 38 miles west of Alderton, on the morning of October 7th. The county coroner had determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest. The vehicle, a 1991 Ford F-150, registered to a Walter R. Marsh of Springfield, Missouri, had been found by a passing driver at approximately 7 in the morning. Personal effects in the vehicle included road maps, a prescription medication bottle, and a small notebook. No next of kin had been located at time of publication. The remains had been processed by the county medical examiner's office. Reva read the article. Then she read it again. 38 miles. He had been 38 miles from Alderton when his heart stopped. On the return, after he had made it here, gone down the ledge, opened the floor, put the letter in the box, sealed everything again, come back up the ledge, gotten in his truck, and driven away. He had done everything he came to do. 38 miles later, on a highway through flat farm country, his heart had given out. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the screen. Delia did not say anything immediately. She had learned in the weeks since Reva had first walked into her store the particular art of being present without narrating it. She was doing it now, sitting beside Reva in the library room with the microfilm machine humming and the afternoon light coming through the narrow windows, and not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. After a while, she put her hand over Reva's hand. "I'm at it far enough," Delia said. She said it quietly, without performance. He sealed that letter. He left everything in the box. He made it far enough for that. Reva looked at the screen. "He was trying to come home," she said. "He got close enough for it to count." There was a difference between those two things, and Reva knew it, and Delia knew it, and they both let it be true at the same time. He had not made it home. He had not seen the town again, or the gorge, or the pump house in daylight with his own eyes after 51 years away. He had driven 9 hours from Springfield and gone down an 18-inch ledge with a bad heart and medication in his pocket, and done the thing he needed to do, and then his body had run out of what it had. 38 miles. She thought about the ledge, the specific difficulty of it. 18 inches of limestone shelf, the narrow section at the curve, the gorge below. Walter had built that ledge in 1957. He had walked it hundreds of times during the 6 years he was water commissioner, in all weathers, in morning dark and late afternoon light, before it became condemned, when it was simply the path to where he worked. He had known every foot of it. In 2012, he had been 84 years old with a heart condition, and she didn't know what else, all the accumulated weight of a long, hard life, and he had driven 9 hours and walked that ledge one more time. She made a copy of the article and folded it into the breast pocket of her jacket with the letter. Then she asked Delia to drive her back to the lot. The hearing was 11 days away. In those 11 days, Reva did 3 things. She kept building. Every morning, she and Grady worked on the framing. The structure was taking shape on the north section of the flat lot, a simple rectangle, 16 feet by 22, oriented to catch the morning light through the east-facing windows. Grady had opinions about window placement and expressed them through the medium of measurements and level checks rather than words, and Reva had learned to read him well enough by now to know that a long silence after a level check meant she should ask him to explain what he was seeing. She read the journal front to back one more time, making notes on the pages she'd flagged, building a specific account of what Walter had done and when and what had been done to him. She was not a lawyer, and she had no illusions about that. But she had the journal, and she had the bonds with their dates, and she had the bi-weekly entries that showed Walter purchasing the bonds on his own time with salary that had been deposited in a personal account and not a public one. She had the meeting minutes Delia had kept for 60 years. She had the deed. She had the letter. The third thing was Simone. Simone had been in the spare section of the storage shed for 3 days by the time the hearing date was confirmed. She had moved through the space with the careful economy of someone who has learned to make no claims on rooms that might be taken back, taking up only the sleeping space Riva had cleared for her, keeping her garbage bag close, accepting food with a directness that Riva recognized as the pragmatism of someone who has not always had enough. She was from a group home in Greenfield. The home had closed due to budget cuts. She had transferred twice and then been processed out of the system at 17 because the paperwork had been filed with an age that was off by 1 year, and no one had caught it until it was already done. She had slept at a bus station, then a church basement, then had started walking without a destination because a moving target was easier to be than a stationary one. She had good hands. Riva noticed this on the second day, watching her work a piece of pine with the hand plane. The stroke was consistent, the pressure, even the grain read correctly before the stroke rather than after. She had learned it in a garage somewhere from a foster placement that had ended badly for unrelated reasons, and the skill had stayed with her because skills do that. They survive the circumstances that produce them. Reva showed her the framing, the basic logic of it, stud spacing, header sizing, the way a corner works. Simone absorbed it the way people absorb things they have been ready to learn without fanfare, setting each piece into place quietly and then waiting for the next piece. She didn't ask much about the hearing. She knew it was happening. Riva had explained the shape of it without going into all the history, and Simone had listened with the focused stillness of someone who understands institutional processes from the inside. She'll need the original purchase records, Simone said one evening while they were eating soup. What Riva said, for the bonds, if Greer's lawyer is arguing they were bought with public time, you need to show the purchase dates and the payroll dates and prove they don't overlap. Simone said it in the same tone she used to describe board thickness and nail gauge. She'd spent 9 years navigating systems that ran on documentation. She knew what documentation could do. How do you know that? Riva said. Simone shrugged. Same way I know how to use a hand plane. Somebody showed me, a caseworker who actually paid attention. She was quiet for a moment. There aren't many of them, but there are some. Riva went to the storage shed and found Walter's journal and opened it to the 1956 entries where he had recorded the payroll dates carefully, the water commissioner's position paid on the 1st and 15th of each month, and the bond purchase dates, which fell on the 18th and 22nd, not the same dates, not public time. She added that to the folder. She, also on Simone's suggestion, filed a public records request with the county archive for Walter's bank statements from 1956 to 1962. She filed it 10 days before the hearing. The records came back in a week, the county archive being efficient in the way of small operations that know their collection well. The statements confirmed what the journal had said: bond purchases on private dates, salary deposited in a personal account, every dollar traceable to an after-tax personal payment, not a public fund. She added those to the folder too. The night before the hearing, Riva didn't sleep much. She lay on the sleeping pad in the partially framed structure, listening to the wind move through the gorge below. Ridge was pressed against her left side. Through the open frame of the east wall, she could see stars, the same stars she'd seen her first night on this lot, when she'd had nothing but a tarp and a dead car 3 miles back on Route 7. She thought about Walter, about what it had taken to build something in a tilted pump house on a cliff face, carrying concrete in small batches at night, working alone so that no one would know and no one could take it, about the particular stubbornness that required, about the particular faith. She thought about Agnes, about sitting at the kitchen table on Mercer Street, watching Agnes work the needle, going through the cloth with that precise motion, the thread following in its exact arc, the quiet industry of it, the belief in the value of the work itself regardless of outcome. She thought about the question she had never asked. Why had Agnes kept the name? What had she known about Walter Marsh? She had called it the Marsh name. She had written, "Keep the name," with the certainty of a woman who understood why it mattered. Agnes must have known something, must have been told something at some point by someone. Claire, maybe, or whoever Claire had trusted before she trusted no one. Riva would never know the full shape of it, but she knew enough. She got up before it was fully light and made coffee in the tin pot she kept in the storage shed and sat at the bluff edge and watched the gorge fill with morning. Then she went in and got ready for the day. The County Board of Supervisors met in the courthouse meeting room, a rectangle of a room with a long table at the front and rows of chairs facing it, wood-paneled, the kind of room that has seen 50 years of county business and carries the weight of it in its air, a heaviness that isn't unpleasant, just present. Riva arrived early. She wore the cleanest clothes she had, which was a standard she had been working towards since the auction. She had a folder with the journal, the copies of the 1961 meeting minutes. Delia had kept the bond bundle with her handwritten notes on purchase and payroll dates, the property deed, Mrs. Faulkner's preliminary assessment from the bank statements from the county archive, and the article from the Alderton Register about Walter's death folded in the breast pocket, separate from everything else. Grady was already in the room when she came in. He nodded once from the second row and went back to looking at his hands. Delia was in the third row. She had come in her work clothes, canvas apron traded for a pressed shirt. She was not looking around the room. She was looking at the front table and waiting. Simone was in the last row. Riva had not asked her to come. Simone had appeared at the storage shed in the morning in the cleanest of what she had and had said nothing about the hearing, just stood there. And Riva had said, "Bring your folder from the shed, the one with the payroll dates, in case we need a second copy," and Simone had gone and gotten it. Nate Greer came in 5 minutes later with a lawyer from the city, a man in a gray suit who carried a leather briefcase with the gait of someone who was billing by the hour and knew it. Nate himself wore a sport coat without a tie. He sat on the opposite side of the aisle from Riva's people and did not look across. The board filed in, 5 members. The chair was a woman named Dr. Patricia Webb, 62, who had the manner of someone who had been running meetings for decades and had no particular investment in how any given meeting was supposed to come out. She called it to order and read the formal complaint and then nodded at the lawyer. How was good? Riva had been told he was good by Delia, who had made discreet inquiries. Watching him was instructive. He used words that sounded reasonable because they were built from reasonable components assembled to point in a direction that was not reasonable. The commercial overlay language from the 2020 master plan was real. The surplus listing procedure was real. The question of whether the overlay should have prevented the listing was a genuine procedural question. He made it sound like the answer was obvious, like only someone unfamiliar with land use governance would think otherwise. The bond argument was more technical. He walked through the state municipal finance statute, carefully citing specific subsections, painting a picture of a county employee who had used public time and public resources to accumulate personal savings that were now arguably properly subject to public claim. He was careful to say arguably. He was careful to say further review would determine. He was not making a firm claim. He was making a question, and a question held in front of the right people in the right room could accomplish a great deal. He talked for 15 minutes. Riva walked to the front. She had never spoken in front of a room before, not like this. She had been in hearings for foster placements, had answered questions from caseworkers and judges and school officials across 9 years, but those were rooms where she answered. This was a room where she was initiating. She held the folder in both hands and looked at the board. "My name is Riva Marsh," she said. "I'm 20 years old. I bought lot 12 at the county surplus auction because I needed somewhere to sleep, and I had $5. She heard the room settle. "After I bought it," she said, "I found a sealed chamber built into the floor of the pump house. Inside it was a leather-bound journal written by my grandfather, Walter Marsh, who built that pump house in 1957. He was the water commissioner of this town. He designed the system that put running water in every house on Main Street." She opened the folder and held up the photograph she had not used as evidence, yet the one she had been saving. It showed a young man in work clothes standing in front of a partially built stone structure on a cliff face, grinning at the camera. He was lean and dark-haired, and he was grinning the way you grin when you are doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing in the world, and you know it. "This is him," she said. "Walter Marsh, 1957. She set the photograph on the table where the board could see it. He was removed from his position in March of 1961. She opened the journal to the March entries and read a section aloud. Not the emotional parts, the factual parts, what Gerald Greer had proposed, and why Walter had opposed it, and what happened to the vote, and how the position had been eliminated and recreated with a different name and given to someone Greer recommended. She set the journal on the table. She had the photocopied meeting minutes from March 14th, 1961, with Tom Farrow's annotation at the bottom. She placed it beside the journal. "With respect to the bonds," she said, "the claim that they may constitute municipal assets under the state finance statute requires that the purchasing occur on public time using public resources." She placed her handwritten chart on the table. The payroll dates and the bond purchase dates did not overlap. Not once in 16 purchases across 6 years. Walter Marsh bought those bonds on his own time with his own salary. She placed the bank statements from the county archive beside the chart. These are his personal bank statements pulled through a public records request. Every bond purchase falls on dates that are inconsistent with any public pay cycle. She looked at the board. "I'm not a developer," she said. "I don't have a master plan or a commercial overlay or a lawyer who bills by the hour. I have a cleared foundation on a bluff and a half-built structure and a grandfather who wanted someone to care about that piece of land as much as he did." She stepped back from the table. "That's what I have," she said. Dr. Webb asked if anyone else wished to address the board. Grady Dutton stood up from the second row. He was not a talker in the ordinary sense, and everyone in the room who knew him knew that, which meant his standing up registered differently than most. "I've been helping Riva build on that lot for 6 weeks," he said. "She works harder and more carefully than anyone I've seen in 40 years of carpentry." He paused in the way he paused when he was about to say the central thing. "What she's building is real. The town could use more of that." He sat down. Delia Farrow stood up. The room knew Delia. Main Street hardware store, silver hair, 30 years of selling people the things they needed to fix what was broken. When Delia Farrow stood up in a county meeting room, it meant something had crossed a threshold. She held the photocopied meeting minutes in her hand, her copy, the original she had kept in her filing cabinet for 60 years. "My father was Tom Farrow," she said. "He is mentioned by name in that journal. He was one of 4 men Walter Marsh hired to build the pump house in 1957. He kept those meeting minutes his entire life because he believed something wrong had happened to Walter Marsh, and he didn't know how to correct it. After he died, I kept them because I didn't know who to give them to." She looked at the board. "Now I know." She sat down. The county attorney, a man named Briggs, who sat at a side table and had been taking notes, cleared his throat and stood briefly. "For the record," he said, "I've reviewed the payroll documentation submitted by the petitioner. The purchase dates for the bonds are inconsistent with any public pay cycle. They were purchased on the 18th and 22nd of their respective months, while the public employee pay cycle for that period ran on the 1st and 15th. There is no overlap. The bond provenance claim has no basis in the statute." He sat down. Nate Greer's lawyer had been writing notes during Delia's statement and the county attorney's clarification. He looked at his client. Nate's expression had not changed in any way that was visible from across the room. He was looking at the table in front of him. The board deliberated for 14 minutes. Dr. Webb returned to the front. "The board has reviewed the formal complaint filed by Greer Development regarding surplus auction lot 12, the Bluff View parcel. We find that the sale was conducted in accordance with county procedures and that no procedural error occurred in the listing or the auction. With respect to the secondary claim regarding the Series E savings bonds, the county attorney has confirmed that the statutory provision cited does not apply given the demonstrated purchase timeline." She looked down the length of the table. "The complaint is denied. The sale stands." She looked at Riva. "The property is yours, Ms. Marsh." Riva stood at the back of the room and heard the sentence arrive. "The property is yours." She had held the possibility of its opposite in her mind for 6 weeks, had worked alongside it, while framing and while reading and while lying awake at 3 in the morning listening to the gorge wind. The loss had been a real possibility. She had not pretended otherwise, had not let herself believe before she was allowed to believe, because she had learned at an early age the specific damage of hoping too early. So now the sentence arrived and she stood there and let it be real. Grady shook her hand, quick and firm and the right length. Delia hugged her, a brief, solid hug, the kind that communicates presence rather than sentiment, and then Delia stepped back and her expression was the same as it always was, level and clear, and Riva was grateful for that. Simone was standing behind her. When Riva turned, the girl was looking at the front of the room with an expression that was not quite readable, the expression of someone processing something at a depth that isn't meant for public viewing. Then she looked at Riva. "The bank paperwork," she said. It should clear faster now. It should, Riva said. Good. Then they walked out of the courthouse. Nate Greer left through a side door. She did not see him go. The lumber arrived 6 days later. A flatbed truck down Tower Road at 7 in the morning. 2 men unloading stacks of fresh-cut dimensional lumber, straight and dry and clearly better quality than anything Riva had purchased from the co-op. Good framing lumber, precisely cut. Plywood, roofing panels, a pallet of fasteners in the specific sizes she had been working with. She came out of the storage shed when she heard the truck and watched the unloading. Who sent this? She said. The driver checked his clipboard. Delivery order paid in full. No name on the slip. He handed her the receipt. The order had been placed from a company account. She read the account name at the top of the receipt and then looked at the tailgate of the truck as it turned around at the end of Tower Road. Greer Development in plain letters on the metal. She stood at the gate with the receipt in her hand and looked at the stacked lumber for a long time. Ridge sat beside her. She thought about what it was and what it wasn't. It wasn't an apology, or not only an apology. It wasn't the same as saying what happened to your grandfather was wrong. It was lumber and fasteners, material things that could be picked up and carried and used, that built walls and roofs and floors that would last. It was something. She picked up the first board and carried it to the framing. The bonds cleared in the second week of November. Mrs. Faulkner called her at Delia's store, where she had been helping inventory the winter supply order, and Riva stood in the hardware store with the phone in her hand and heard the number again, $52,341 in an account in her name. She finished the inventory. Then she walked back to the lot and stood at the bluff edge and looked at the gorge. The November light was flat and cold, the creek lower than it had been in September, running clear over the pale boulders. The ledge was visible below her, 18 inches of limestone shelf running along the cliff face to the pump house. She had walked it 37 times since that first crossing. She had counted. She had stopped being afraid of it somewhere around the 15th time and had not been afraid since, though she remained careful, which was different from afraid. She thought about what $52,000 meant in practical terms. It meant the structure could be completed properly, not the minimum viable version she had been calculating toward, but the right version. Insulated walls, a real floor, windows that fit their frames, a wood stove that drew well and was correctly sized for the space, a bathroom with hot water, a roof that would last a decade without needing attention, and beyond the small house, something else, something she had been thinking about since Grady had told her that Miriam would have been here on day one with sandwiches and lumber, something she had been thinking about since she'd read Walter's journal entries about the satisfaction of building a system that gave a whole town clean water, something she had been thinking about since she'd watched Simone take those long, even strokes on the hand plane and known in her hands before she knew it, in her head, what she was looking at. A space for work, a space where people could come and learn to build things, where hands that had been sitting idle could learn what they were capable of. Walter had built the pump house to give water to a town that needed it. She thought about what she wanted to build. She went inside and drew it. The workshop took shape through December and into January. It was built on the foundation slab that the storage shed had occupied, expanded by 12 feet on the south side, using the structural logic Grady had been teaching her since September. He came every day. He had developed a Tuesday and Thursday morning session that he called a class. though it looked more like work because it was work, and the people who came to do something rather than be taught, which was the best kind of class. A man named Ruiz, who was restoring an antique rocking chair he'd found at a yard sale and wanted it done right. Two women from the church who wanted to learn to use a table saw for a project they were cagey about describing, but which turned out eventually to be a set of raised garden beds for the community plot behind the school. A father and his teenage son building a bookshelf that the son had apparently promised his mother for Christmas and was going to deliver in January, which was still a promise kept in the important sense. Grady installed a coffee maker on the workbench in February. He brought it from his garage, set it up between the belt sander and a jar of wood screws, and did not make a speech about it. It was just there the next morning when people arrived. Everyone who came to the workshop knew where it was. Simone enrolled in the county high school in January. This had taken some negotiation, not because Simone was unwilling, but because the paperwork for a 17-year-old with a complicated foster history in another state required a particular kind of patience to untangle. Delia knew the school secretary. The school secretary knew the principal. The principal had a daughter who had done a foster care advocacy project for a state competition 3 years running, 3 phone calls. Simone had sat in the car in the school parking lot on the first morning and looked at the building for a long time without speaking. "I haven't been in school in 2 years," she said. "I hadn't been in one in 6 when I started studying for my classes," Riva said. "You don't have to figure it all out today. Just go in." Simone had looked at her with an expression that was hard to name exactly, something between skepticism and a willingness to believe that the skepticism wanted to protect her from. "Why do you care what happens to me?" she said. Riva thought about Walter. She thought about Agnes's tin box and the handwriting in the lid. She thought about the 6 letters Walter had written to the foster care board and the monthly phone calls and the private investigator and the way none of it had been enough to get him through the door, but it had all been enough to get her here. "Because somebody cared what happened to me," she said, "and you can't pay that back. You can only pay it forward." Simone had gotten out of the car. She walked in. Nate Greer came to the workshop on a Saturday in March. He came through the gate with a girl who was 8 or 9, dark-haired and serious, carrying a backpack with a small stuffed animal clipped to the zipper. The girl looked at the workbench and the tools and the coffee maker and the half-finished bookshelf that was no longer the father and son project, but had become a community project in the way things do when they're left on the bench between sessions. "This is my daughter Olivia," Nate said. "She wants to build something." Riva looked at him. How was different from the man who had stepped out of the SUV with a business card. His shoulders were lower. His voice had shed the register that went with the leather briefcase. He was holding his daughter's hand, and the grip was straightforward. A father with a daughter. Nothing more complicated than that. She introduced him to Grady, who was already setting up the sawhorses for the morning session. Grady handed Olivia a pre-cut pine board and a small hammer and showed her the birdhouse kit that had been sitting on the 3rd bench since Grady had donated his last 12 of them from the garage stockpile that had finally gotten completely out of hand. Nate stood nearby and watched his daughter tap nails into wood. He looked like any other parent in the workshop, which was Riva thought what he was. He didn't mention the lawsuit. He didn't mention the hearing or the commercial overlay or the lumber delivery. Neither did she. There were things that could be said and things that were more accurately expressed in other ways, and the lumber had already been said. But before he left something happened that Riva would think about later. Olivia finished with her lopsided but earnest birdhouse came to find her father, while Grady was cleaning up at the far end of the workshop. She stood at Nate's side and looked up at him with the direct, evaluating gaze of children who have not yet learned to soften their questions. "Is this the place you were trying to make us not get?" she said. The room was not quiet. There were still 3 people at the benches, but Riva was close enough to hear it, and she saw what it did to Nate's face, not the professional calculation of the man who had stepped out of the SUV, something that moved underneath that something older and less managed. He crouched down to Olivia's level. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather wanted something that belonged to someone else," he said. "I was trying to finish what he started." He looked at his daughter steadily. "I should have paid more attention to whether that was a good reason to start." Olivia looked at the workshop, at Grady washing up, at Simone showing a teenager something about measuring, at Ridge in the doorway. The girl who built it said, "We can come back," Olivia said. Nate looked at Riva, who was standing close enough that he knew she'd heard. "We can," Riva said. He walked his daughter to the gate. After he had gone, Grady appeared at Riva's elbow and picked up the chisel she had set down. "His grandfather got what he wanted in 1961, Grady said. "Man's been carrying that." "I know," Riva said. Grady handed her the chisel and went back to his class. She thought about what it would be to carry the weight of what Gerald Greer had done, to grow up in the family that had benefited from it, to build a career on land and water rights in a county where the origin of some of those rights was what it was, to one day sit in a hearing room and listen to a young woman read from a journal written by the man your grandfather had driven out, and to understand clearly for the first time what had actually happened, to have a daughter who would ask about it. She thought he would tell his daughter the truth. She didn't know that for certain, but she thought so. Before he left, he stopped by Riva's bench. She had a good time, he said, nodding toward Olivia, who was carrying the lopsided birdhouse with both hands, with the particular pride of someone who made the thing and knows the making counted. "She's welcome back any time," Riva said. Nate was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that cost him something to say. She could hear the cost in it, the way a person's voice changes when they are being honest about something they would have preferred not to examine. "I'm sorry," he said, "about the hearing, about all of it. There's more to be sorry for than just the hearing, but that's where I can start." He said it simply, without the professional smoothness of the man who had showed up in the lot with a business card, just a man saying a thing he meant. "I know," Riva said, which was not forgiveness exactly, or not only that. It was acknowledgement, the recognition that a sentence like his had been said and received and could now be part of the record of what had happened here. He walked his daughter to the gate. After he had gone, Grady appeared at Riva's elbow and handed her the chisel and went back to his class. The first warm Saturday in April, Riva stood in the doorway of the small house and watched the workshop. It had taken the shape she had drawn in November, expanded by the generosity of the community and the wood Greer had sent, and 6 months of work on mornings and evenings, and the kind of sustained effort that accumulates without drama, without announcement, becoming the texture of the days. So gradually, you stop noticing the moment it became that, and just know it is there. A long workbench on the south wall, tools hung on pegboard that Delia had donated from the store, an open frame structure with canvas roll-down panels for bad weather. The foundation was the concrete slab that had been on this lot since before Riva was born, the same limestone beneath it that the gorge had been forming for 10 million years before that. The coffee maker was on. She could smell it from the doorway. Grady was demonstrating dovetail joints to a woman who had driven 30 minutes to be there because she'd heard about it from the woman who made the raised garden beds, who had heard from the father with the son, who finally delivered the bookshelf, and whose mother had said in a Christmas morning voice that the finished work was excellent. Simone was at the far bench, walking a young man of about 16 through the basics of measuring for a frame. He was a neighbor's kid who had started showing up because Ridge was friendly and the coffee was free, and who had turned out to have a head for spatial geometry and hands that wanted to be doing something precise. Simone had been showing him things for 3 weeks without anyone formally organizing it, which was the best way. She talked more now than she had in October. She still moved through spaces with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to take up more room than she was certain was available, but the calibration of certainty had been shifting. She had opinions about timber grade and window flashing and the proper sequence of steps when installing a door frame. She had stopped saving half her food automatically. She had replaced the sneakers with the separating soles with a pair Delia had found at the church sale and pressed upon her with the same certainty with which she pressed everything. Ridge lay in the doorway of the house in the April sun with his chin on his paws and his eyes half open, tracking the movement in the workshop with the contentment of an animal that has found the right place. Riva had enrolled in the Structural Engineering Extension Program in March. She had chosen the field because of Walter, because of the journal entries about pressure differentials and pump mechanics, and the satisfaction of designing a system that gave a whole town clean water, and because she had recognized in those entries the same feeling she got when she sank a nail clean on the first swing, the feeling of something going correctly into its right position in the world. She still worked at Delia's store 4 mornings a week. Delia still made soup that she claimed was leftover and wasn't. Grady still came every morning with his toolbox. Some things become the texture of a place, and you stop noticing the moment they became that. She walked to the bluff edge. The gorge in April was different from the gorge in September. Greener, the vegetation asserting itself on the ledges and in the crevices of the stone face. The creek higher from snowmelt, moving with more urgency over the pale boulders, carrying the sound of the mountains in it. The ledge was visible below her, running along the cliff face to the pump house. The pump house itself was unchanged, still tilted, still standing. She had been down the ledge 7 times since the hearing, twice alone 5 times, with students from the engineering extension program who had written to her after she submitted a case study on the chamber construction as an informal assignment. The tilt and the original stress calculations and the way the cliff face had served as the load-bearing back wall were apparently interesting to people who knew how to evaluate what interesting meant in structural terms. She went down now. The ledge was familiar. She knew the narrow section, the way the limestone varied in texture at the curve, the point where she needed to move her right foot first and keep her left palm flat against the wall. The 40 feet were still 40 feet. She was still careful, but the careful had become the kind of careful that is competence rather than fear, which was a different quality of attention altogether. She pushed open the pump house door. The room was the same. The tilted floor, the crack in the east wall with the gorge light coming through it, the 2 small south windows catching the April morning. The floor stones, the panels she had levered, opened the now empty chamber below. She had fitted a hinged wood cover over the opening after the contents were removed, a simple thing solid, properly set. It looked like part of the floor. She sat on the floor where she had sat when she read the letter, her back against the cliff face wall. Ridge was not with her today. He had stayed above at the gate, which was his way of indicating that he considered the ledge her business and the gate his. She had the journal with her. She opened it to the front page. Walter Marsh, Water Commissioner, Alderton, April 1957. The handwriting was as she had first seen it in September, neat and deliberate, each letter given its full space. She had read these pages so many times now that they moved through her less like discovery and more like the familiar pattern of something known. She knew the shape of his handwriting in the good years and the Missouri years and the late entries in the back section. She knew the way his pen pressed harder when he was angry and the way the letters opened slightly when he was proud of something. She had brought a pencil. She turned to the inside of the front cover. There was a small space there before the first entry. She had looked at it many times. The blank space where a person might write something. She wrote carefully, Reva Marsh, Workshop, Alderton, April 2025. She looked at the two lines, his name and hers 68 years apart, on the same page. Then she closed the journal. She sat there for a while in the tilted room with the gorge sound coming up through the limestone and the April light coming through the east wall crack. The same water that had been running through this gorge since long before any of this happened, since before the pump house was built, or the ledge was cut, or the chamber was poured. The water didn't know about any of it. It just ran. She thought about the sentence Simone had said in October, standing at the gate with her garbage bag. I saw the sign on the highway, community workshop, free tools and classes. She thought about what it meant that the sign existed, that when Simone had walked through the gate with her garbage bag and her separated sole sneakers and her 9 years of moving through institutions that had done their best and their worst, there had been peanut butter sandwiches and a hand plane and no questions that couldn't wait. She had not set out to build that. She had set out to sleep somewhere. She had set out to spend $5 on a condemned parcel because at least a condemned parcel with her name on it was better than a highway shoulder. But here was the workshop. Here was Ridge at the gate and Grady with the coffee maker and Simone walking a 16-year-old through the correct way to measure for a frame. Here was Delia Farrow with her father's meeting minutes and 60 years of keeping faith with something she hadn't known how to name until the right person walked through her store door. Here was a woman who drove 30 minutes to learn dovetail joints because someone she knew had learned to make raised garden beds here and had told her about it. Here was the April light on the limestone. Walter had built the pump house to give water to a town that needed it. She was beginning to understand what she had built. She stood up, set the journal carefully inside her jacket against her chest, the worn leather against the worn canvas, walked to the door. The ledge was waiting, the bluff above it, the workshop above that with the coffee going and the tools on the pegboard and the sound of someone learning to make something for the first time. She stepped out onto the ledge, moved carefully, the way she always moved now, reading the rock underfoot, one hand trailing the wall, through the narrow section, past the curve, to the widening at the base of the bluff. She climbed up to the flat lot and came through the gate. Ridge lifted his head and looked at her. She put her hand on his back, felt the easy breathing of a dog in the morning sun, the slow, undramatic rhythm of a creature that had found where it belonged and was content to stay there. The workshop was going. She went to work.